What is the best time to drive for Uber and Lyft in 2025 where you're going to make the most amount of money? This is going to get very interesting because things have changed, especially for 2025. Welcome back to Buck Living, a channel all about making money where I'm documenting our journey to get $1 million on YouTube. Let's get into this because, of course, I talk about different ways to make money, one of them being Uber and Lyft. And one of the biggest ways to make money when it comes to Uber and Lyft is driving at the right time. It's very, very timely about how and when you drive. I've talked about this in a lot of different videos. But in 2025, a few things have changed. And I'm going to break it down into 3 different categories on this video. The first is the growth of the hourly change, which we'll talk about. Second is the peak hour paradox, which we'll talk about. And third is all the unique things going on that are too overlooked and is a good way to maximize your income. Now, first up, let's talk about driving anytime. If you talk to anybody when it comes to Uber and Lyft, even if you don't drive, people probably know. When is the best time to drive? Well, morning commutes, 7 to 9 a.m. Evening commutes, 5 to 7 p.m. Friday and Saturday nights, 9 p.m. till about 3 a.m. This has been Uber Lyft 101. Most people know this, even if they don't drive for Uber and Lyft. The more traffic that's happening, the more people that are ordering Ubers and Lyfts, the more money you're going to make because it's a huge surge, right? And this is why Uber and Lyft constantly gives out bonuses and incentives. They have different, peaks that are happening, all this kind of stuff. Now, back in the day, if you drove during a non-peak hour or any other time besides those exact peak hours like I just mentioned, it was like feast or famine. Feast or famine where you could not make any money, and if you did, it was very, very little. Now, though, I've talked about in different pro tip videos that on a Friday and Saturday night, you have the pregame hours, which I think sometimes you can make a lot of money. So like 5 p.m. to like 9 p.m. on a Friday and Saturday is kind of when people are going out to their friend's place. They're not drunk yet. So this is a good way to make more money. Like if, let's say, you don't want to drive around drunk people, you're driving them to their friend's place because they're getting ready to go out. I call it the pregame hours. But then I realized over the years, as Uber and Lyft has gotten more popular, and that's a very important point for this video, which is both good and bad, that, Saturday and Sunday mornings are now more popular. Like say you wake up at your friend's place, you want to Uber back to your place. Like say you wake up on a Saturday or Sunday, you want to do a Sunday fun day, you want to go to brunch, have some mimosas, or whatever. I start to notice that around 10 a.m. to about 2 or 3 p.m. were good times to drive on Saturday and Sunday. Then, after interviewing well over 1,000 drivers on this channel, one big time that I've talked about as well is 4 a.m. to 10 a.m. Well, let's say I would never do this, and I never have and never will, but I know some people do love it. You wake up at, let's say, 3:30, start driving at 4. From 4 a.m. to about 7 or 8, you do mostly airport rides. So let's say if your airport rides in your area are very coveted and they pay a lot, good time to drive. Then you do the morning commuting hours, like 7 a.m. to about 9-ish a.m., 10 a.m., and then at that point, you have to wake up at 3:30 a.m. to start driving, but now you're done at 10 a.m. And if you want to have the day to yourself, to go to the beach, to be outside, go for a hike or whatever you want to do, you have the full day to yourself. So one thing you may be noticing as I'm mentioning all these other times besides the peak hours is this. And this day and age with how popular Uber and Lyft is, you can almost drive any time and make money. So one thing that's changed in 2025, I feel like, is back in the day, it was so black or white. Even looking back 10 years ago, a decade, which is a long time, don't get me wrong, when I first started driving, it was feast or famine, very black or white. You either made a good amount of money or almost nothing at all. It could be either $30 in an hour or $4 in an hour, which is what sometimes I made in an off-peak hour. Like, you never drove in the off-peak hours. Now, though, it's a bit more vague, right? Like, yes, I do think there are some peak times to drive, of course, where you are going to make the most amount of money, don't get me wrong. But now in 2025, it's kind of changed that because, in a good way, talking about the positives now, in a good way, that because Uber and Lyft is so popular, everyone's always ordering Ubers and Lyfts, especially if you live in like a very upbeat city like LA, Vegas, Boston, San Francisco, etc. People's schedules are not normal. And I think this is also, in an interesting point, a bit of a positive aspect from the pandemic that a lot of people are working from home. A lot of people's schedules now are not the conventional 9 to 5. Like, things have changed, right? Just when it comes to the job landscape. So people ordering Ubers and Lyfts 10 years ago, at, let's say 1 p.m., not that common. Now, it's way more common from the popularity and the irregularity of people's schedules, right? And this is a huge thing where now, I feel like, if anything, is one of the best times to drive. I mean, you could look at that from different perspectives, right? In some ways, I think 2025 is one of the best times to drive for Uber and Lyft. It's also one of the worst. And I've talked a lot about this in very in-depth videos, right? But on one end, I want to say that because there's now so many people ordering Ubers and Lyfts, because of the irregular schedules and whatnot, it's an amazing time to drive for Uber and Lyft, where the peak hours aren't as much cutthroat anymore. You could drive whenever you want, however you want. Like I said, almost any hour of the week, whether it's the pregame hours, Saturday and Sunday mornings, Friday and Saturday nights, the typical peak hours, 4 a.m. to 10 a.m., there's a lot of times to drive where you can make a lot more money. And I think back in the day, if you drove during the off-peak hours, wasn't worth it. Now, you can almost drive anytime you want, right? Which is great, especially when you factor into the fact of, depending on your area, like say here in California, we now have minimum hourly guarantees. Those also exist in Massachusetts. So you can literally drive anytime and make at least a minimum hourly guarantee. That's awesome. So the first thing is, never been a better time to drive for Uber and Lyft, where when you have to ask me, what is the best time to drive? Almost any time now. Although I will say, I still think the morning and evening commutes, Friday and Saturday nights, will still be your best bet. But test it out, you never know. That's the first thing I'm going to say. Second point in this video, talking about when is the best time to drive for Uber and Lyft in 2025. This is now a negative aspect of the popularity of Uber and Lyft. And I call this the peak hour paradox. I've mentioned this in a few videos already. But what I mean is, it seems to be that because the best times to drive, for most people, if you had to ask most people, best time to drive, Friday and Saturday nights is really the top. That's the top most talked about answer, and it makes sense, right? When you drive around people who have been drinking, they want to be safe and responsible. That's when the surges are high, all this kind of stuff. The tricky thing, though, is if everybody's driving during those peak hours, if all the drivers are like, oh, it's a Friday night, time to bust out my car and drive and everything, that means it's harder for people to get rides. Or that means it's harder for these drivers to get rides. Because, yeah, there are more people ordering Ubers and Lyfts than ever before. But in 2025, there's also more drivers on the road than ever before. And I've interviewed a lot of drivers, which is almost this paradox, kind of unfortunate, where they say, hey, I'm not going to lie, I actually now make less money on a Friday night. Like, yeah, sometimes it can be surging, but because so many drivers try to drive on a Friday night, it almost makes it too congested. There's too many drivers on the road, too many cooks in the kitchen, and as a result, it's harder to get a ride, and when I do, it's not really that surging, et cetera, et cetera. So I've had some drivers tell me that in an odd paradox, the peak hours, or the most peak hour, Friday and Saturday nights, tend to sometimes now be the worst times to drive. A big thing I say in so many different videos, test out the waters. You genuinely never know when's the best time to drive. Your location is the number one factor that determines how much money you can make as a driver, but it does vary, right? It does vary on a lot of different factors, and this is why I suggest to a lot of people test out both apps, test different situations. It is very unfortunate. And I do want to mention that because maybe you're watching this video being like, hey, Mark, I disagree. In my area on a Friday night, it is still popping. I still make a ton of money, and I make the most amount of money on a Friday night. No issue. You never know, though. In other areas, take here in LA, when I have interviewed LA drivers, I have heard from a lot of them like, yeah, Friday nights are not what it used to be. There's just too many people working, right? So in combination with the first one, like I said, although on one end, because there's more people taking Ubers and Lyfts than ever before, that's a positive aspect. That now the window of when you can truly make a good amount of money is now bigger. When it comes to these grand, huge peak hours, maybe not as much anymore. And that can be unfortunate on the second point. Now, the third thing I want to say, when is the best time to drive for Uber and Lyft in 2025 is events/bonuses. Basically, these one-off situations that are not super consistent, but are the way to maximize your earnings. So this is one of the biggest pro tips I have among, if I had to give like 5 pro tips of how to make the most amount of money, like the 5 best pro tips. I've done a lot of pro tip videos on this channel, well over 50, 60, 70 sometimes pro tips. If I had to pick my top 5 biggest ways to make the most amount of money with Uber and Lyft, it is looking at the bonuses and events. These kind of one-off things where, let's say on a Wednesday night, there's a basketball game. Like say there's a concert. Like say there's a convention. Like say there's graduations. Like say there's basically something where there's a lot of people in a given area and they're ordering Ubers and Lyfts. That is by far, although it's temporary, by far the best way to make the most amount of money. And this is why I suggest to a lot of people in 2025 that still blows my mind that a lot of drivers don't really take advantage of the events. And I've done videos, they're listed below in the description, of how to use all these tools in the Uber driver app and the Lyft driver app. They're 2 different videos about different hacks in the Uber driver app and the Lyft driver app that you probably didn't know. And when it comes to these hack videos, a lot of the tricks I show you is like how to set alerts, how to look at kind of the weekly graph of where the traffic might be, the predictions that Lyft might have or Uber might have. And these are really cool ways to kind of look at all these features and find the events. Because like I said, events usually almost always, one consistent thing for the past decade when I first started driving till now is events always pay the most amount of money because there's a lot of people, think of it like I said, a concert, like a sport game. There's a lot of people ordering Ubers and Lyfts, a lot of people drinking, a lot of people want to get to and from there safely. There's a lot of traffic too. You're talking sometimes about thousands. I mean, think of it like a typical sports game. You're talking about thousands upon thousands of people ordering Ubers and Lyfts to get home or to get there, right? And the second point among that when it comes to events is bonuses, right? This is why I suggest sign up with both apps because, yeah, maybe on Saturday during the day, maybe it'd be an okay time to drive, maybe not. But in 2025, with Uber and Lyft constantly doing these bonuses, maybe on a random Saturday, they say, hey, today we're doing a flash bonus, which happens if you do 15 rides today, you get an extra 100, 200 bucks. That's a great way to make money during that day, of course, in terms of you doing the normal rides, but also you get that bonus at the end of doing it. And so when it comes to driving in 2025, when it comes to the best times to drive, one thing you may notice as a common thread throughout this entire video of the 3 points, the fact that you can pretty much drive anytime, especially when you look at the legality of minimum hourly guarantees now happening more around the country. When you look at the peak hour paradox, a negative aspect. And then when you look at the events and bonuses, it's kind of all over the place. It's kind of all over the place where in 2025, it's never been more kind of ambiguous of the best times to drive. And I think this is, if anything, looking at a big global, big picture perspective, if anything, I think this is a good thing. We're now in this day and age, it is not that black or white like before, like I mentioned. Now, you can pretty much drive anytime you want. And as long as you study your analytics, you study the best times to drive in your area given how you drive. As long as you look at the events and the bonuses, and you look at things in a very, very smart, almost tactful way, like a chess match, that is the best way to optimize your income by driving at the best times.